And we are live. Welcome to Olivia's Stories, ladies and gentlemen. A simple suggestion led to my husband divorcing me. I didn't end up doing what I was thinking, but I had to pay for it. Maybe I should have given it a deep thought before telling him, and now am being served divorce papers. I never thought that suggesting to open our marriage would not sit well with my husband. I thought he also had the same idea, but I never knew we were far apart. My name is Jessica. I am a 26-year-old fashion designer. The name of my husband is Fred, and he is a 29-year-old banker. My husband and I have been together for 3 years now. My husband and I met at a family function that my mother hosted. I was invited to attend that function since I designed most of the dresses worn by the ladies. I loved my work, and my mother was very proud of me. I didn't exactly like going to those kinds of parties because my mother was always trying to match me with somebody. On that faithful day, I met my husband Fred, talking to my mother, and like every other day, I didn't even look his way. I quickly spoke to my mother and left before she could introduce us. On my way running out of the event at some point, I ran into Gabrielle. Gabrielle was such a lovely woman. I met her through my mother, and I had made some dresses for her. She was always very kind to me, and she supported my work. I respected Gabrielle a lot, and that was why I followed her when she pulled me back into the event. She kept on talking about how her grandson is sweet and all, and at some point I had to tune her out. I thought it was time for me to leave when she pulled me across the hall to where my mother was standing talking to a man. Gabrielle introduced him as his grandson Fred, and at that moment I was very much interested because Fred is a very handsome man. Fred and I got talking, and he told me about what he did for a living, and he complimented me about my work, which I was grateful for. Fred and I exchanged numbers, and from there we started speaking. At that point, I did want to be in a relationship because I had just left one which was not very good. Fred had assured me he was not like every other guy, and I believed him. Fred took me out on dates, which I was very happy with. He was very attentive to me, and I loved that. Things were going smoothly, and at some point Fred asked me to be his girlfriend, and I accepted. I was skeptical about it because I genuinely loved Fred, and I knew he loved me too. While we dated, I discovered that Fred had lost his mother at a very early age, and he was raised by his grandmother, Gabrielle. I got to meet his whole family. His grandmother, who he adored so much, was his everything, and she approved of our relationship. A few months later, Fred and I got married in a very beautiful way. I could say that I was totally in love. We bought a house together, and we moved in together. Our marriage was beautiful at some point, and we were the ideal couple. We went out on regular dates, went on vacations, attended so many functions and parties together. Our lives were moving perfectly and felt surreal. Of course, we had different arguments from time to time, but we always found our way back to each other. We didn't really stay mad at each other for long and had our ways of settling each argument. A year into our marriage, things began to change. I started traveling a lot for my work, and I didn't have time. Fred also got promoted, and most times he was not at home. It was as if everything was not in our favor. Whenever I had time to spare before a trip, Fred could be in another state, but we made sure to find time, even if it was an hour in those days, to spend together. It got worse at some point that we didn't see each other for over 6 months. Sure, we talked on the phone and made video calls, but it was different. I was busy creating my designs one day when Gabrielle worked into my office like every other day. I thought it was going to be a very good afternoon with her talking about random things, but it wasn't. I felt like everything started from there. She scolded me about not being present in my marriage and how I was neglecting my house and all. I decided to make her understand that I wasn't neglecting my duties as a wife and that Fred has been busy with work. And she told me that Fred had complained to her that I am no longer available at home and that work had taken most of my time. I was shocked to hear that because it was Fred, who I had not seen in a couple of weeks. I knew we went 6 months without seeing each other, but after that, I decided it was not going to happen again, and I hired more people to work for me in order for me to spend more time with my husband. And so, when Gabrielle was talking to me about what Fred had said, I was disappointed. I made Gabrielle understand what was going on, but she didn't want to see things from my own perspective. I understood how much she meant to Fred, and that's why I decided to let her go on and on about what she didn't really understand. When Gabrielle left, I was so angry because I felt like if by chance Fred and I had issues in our relationship, He shouldn't talk to his grandmother first, but to me, his wife, in order for us to solve the problem. After a few days, Fred returned from his trip, and I decided to talk to him about his grandmother's visit, to which he apologized and said at that time he didn't know what to do. And we hadn't seen each other for 6 months, and he needed to speak to someone. I understood what he meant, and we decided to resolve our issues and cut back the hours we were working in order for us to have enough time for each other. Fred began to work less, and I also did the same. We started coming back home to each other early. I started cooking dinners for us, we hung out with friends, and it was as if we started dating again. During the next couple of months, we celebrated Fred's birthday. It was celebrated in grand style. I trusted Gabrielle to take such things to the next level. We also invited friends and colleagues. It was indeed beautiful. A year later, and we were back to where things were. We were working more now, and we saw each other. We could only meet during Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners, and at that point I felt like we were drifting apart. I hardly saw Fred, which I was not happy about. At some point, I started thinking that maybe he was seeing someone else. I didn't want to think too much into it, and I decided to take my mind off things. I was busy with work when my mother came to visit me. She complained about not seeing me in months, and I had to explain to her that I had been occupied. She had asked about Fred, to which I explained things to her. My mother was a typical housewife who didn't understand the need for a woman to work if her husband was providing for her. That's why she was always responsible for putting together events for my father when he was alive, and that had been her thing today. But I didn't want to be a mere housewife who was responsible for taking care of events. I wanted to make a name for myself. I knew she was not going to understand, so I let it be. Apart from me being in love with Fred at that moment, she contributed to me marrying Fred. She kept going on and on about how I was too successful, and I should be grateful I saw a man who was willing to marry me. I knew she meant well, but that wasn't me. I had always wanted to work for my own money. My mother left my store, and I received a call from Gabrielle saying she would like to see me and my husband Fred in 2 days' time, and that it was very urgent. I didn't know what was going on, and so I said I should call Fred. I called him, but it went straight to voicemail. I knew he had been avoiding my calls, but I thought I had given him some heads up concerning what his grandmother had said. I wondered what she could possibly have to tell us. I hoped she was not sick because she meant a lot to Fred and that could break him. I thought to myself, and I didn't know what to do when it was time to go see Gabrielle because I still haven't got hold of Fred. I decided to go there and explain things to her. But on getting there, I saw Fred talking and laughing with his grandmother. I was very shocked. Fred came back and didn't think to return my calls or even come back home. And to make matters worse, he was behaving like we were not having issues in front of his grandmother. That threw me off balance. He was portraying a happy family in front of his grandmother, and we didn't see each other for weeks. I decided to have a talk with him when we were left alone, and he had told me that he didn't want to disappoint his grandmother and that I should play along. I asked him why he ignored my calls and decided not to answer me. I felt at that point Fred had changed. He was not the person I married. I knew we had been busy and all, but that can't possibly drive a rift between us, right? Gabrielle returned, and she sat down and we began talking. Immediately I asked if she was sick, but she responded she wasn't. The reason she called us was because Fred and I had been married for 3 years now without children. I felt taken back. I looked at Fred and he looked indifferent. Before I could understand what was going on, Gabrielle started crying, saying she was getting old and she needed to see her grandchildren before she died. I was about to explain to her that it cannot be possible right now when Fred interrupted me and said, we could give her what she wants. At that moment, I felt like crying because my husband was not listening to me, and he was promising Gabrielle something we should have discussed as a couple instead of him taking the decision on his own. I looked at Gabrielle and she was very happy. I wanted to speak with Fred, but he left saying he needed to attend to something. Few hours later, I left Gabrielle's house. While I was on my way home, I thought about everything, and I was very sad. I got home and I saw that Fred was at home. I decided to confront him about what had happened, but he said he was going to make his grandmother happy, whether I liked it or not, and I tried to explain to him that We can't bring a child into our midst because we barely had time for ourselves and that a child could complicate things. I told him that we should really explain things to Gabrielle, to which he bluntly refused. Fred seemed not to listen to me at that moment. All he cared about was how to grant his grandmother wishes and also to make her happy. I'm not against birthing a child, not at all. I just didn't want my child to lack attention from us. And also, I didn't want my child to be left in the hands of a nanny. The fact that Fred didn't understand me at that moment made me very upset, and we ended up in a heated argument. He didn't see things from my own perspective, and I think I also didn't understand where he was coming from. Yes, every couple would literally want to have a child, but in our case, we barely had time for each other, and so bringing in a child at that time was a very bad idea. Truly, I wasn't ready to quit my job, and so also Fred wasn't ready either. I didn't have a problem working, but I have a problem staying at home doing nothing. I didn't want to be a full-time housewife that would always stay at home watching TV and doing house chores. I'm not trying to condemn those that are full-time housewives. Honestly, it is not a bad thing to be a full-time housewife, but that life is not for me. I love my career with passion, and I like putting a smile on my clients' faces. I wanted to also put a smile on Gabriella and my family. But it seemed like I wasn't doing enough, because I literally did try to make them happy, most especially Gabriella. Weeks went by, and Gabriella constantly reminded us about wanting to see her grandchildren. And so one day, I called my husband and told him that we really need to settle this issue of having a child. Of course, he didn't feel the heat like I had felt back then because everyone thought I was the problem. Fred was guilty. In fact, we both were guilty, but he made it look as if I was the problem. So Fred and I talked on the phone, and I asked him if he would be home the coming weekend so we could patch things out. He told me to give him about 30 minutes so that he could get back to me and that he was in a meeting. I agreed, and we ended the call. After getting off the phone with my husband, I picked my bag and headed home. It was time for me to close for the day, so I went home and hoped that my husband would keep to his promise and return the call. I arrived home and met an empty house as usual. I had my shower and changed into my pajamas. I was about heading to the kitchen to fix something for dinner when my husband called. He apologized for not keeping to the time. We asked ourselves how our day went, and I asked about the meeting he had that day, if everything went okay, and he responded positively. I asked him if he could come back that weekend so we could talk things out, most especially the child aspect. And he assured me that he was going to come. We talked about a few things on the phone before we ended the call. I went ahead and had my dinner and watched my regular TV night shows before I retired to bed for the night. World Cup the next day very early and headed home. Apparently, one of my good clients had booked to be styled for a photo shoot, so I left home before 5 a.m. I went to the client house with my crew members and all the equipment we needed to carry out our job. It was a birthday photo shoot, and we needed to deliver effectively. At the photo shoot, I met my old schoolmate, Becca. I was a year older than Becca, and also a year ahead of her when we were in college. It was a mutual friendship, and Becca seemed calm back then in school. I asked her what she was doing in the studio, and she said the lady I was styling at that moment was her cousin's sister. She just came around to her cousin's sister with a couple of things. She also told me that she had no idea that I was the stylist that always styled her cousin. She complimented on my style of fashion and hoped to be like me someday. I felt so happy, and at that moment I was very proud of myself for being able to put this through all by myself. It was a proud moment for me, guys. LOL. Becca and I chatted for a long time while I left my crew members to work. I usually left my clients with my crew members because I also wanted them to learn. And so, I gave them a chance to represent me, which they often deliver effectively. Becca and I talked a lot about school, businesses, and personal life. I really enjoyed conversing with Becca. I was so engrossed in the conversation that I literally forgot what I came there to do at first. I also showed her the work I had done and a few other things. And so, guys, I really had a nice time with Becca. 30 minutes later, we all were set to leave and bade ourselves farewell. Becca and exchanged contacts and got in touch with each other. I and my crew members headed straight to the store and continued our daily routine. It was at that time my phone rang, and it was my husband calling. He called to tell me that he would be coming back home the next day. I got off the phone and continued with what I was doing. So guys, the next morning, I didn't go to work because it was on a Saturday. I don't normally work on weekends because I decided to limit my workload. That day, my husband was expected to come back home, and so I waited for him. Few hours later, Fred arrived home, and I welcomed him as usual. I wanted him to have a rest before telling him what I had in mind. He went and freshened up, and a few minutes later, he came down to have lunch. I went to the sitting room to continue watching my movie. Fred later came over to where I was seated and asked me what was so important that I had to call him over to discuss. He told me he was curious to know, and he paid attention to me. At that moment, I didn't know how to put it out to him because I'd gotten so furious. Somehow I mustered the courage and told him we should open up our marriage since we barely see each other or spend time together. We would still be a couple, and our families don't need to know about it. I also told him I wasn't ready to have a child just yet because we both don't have time, and I wasn't ready to be a full-time mom. I wanted to concentrate more on my career until I was ready. Immediately I said that. Fred yelled at me and almost gave me a slap. He was shocked and at the same time looked at me in utmost disgust. I saw through his eyes that he was really disappointed in me. Fred left my side and went inside the room. In that state of anger, Fred broke a lot of valuables and even broke our wedding pictures. I tried to calm him down, but he didn't listen. I ran out of the house because I didn't want Fred to harm me. So guys, I told Fred about my suggestion and he got really mad. I haven't seen Fred that mad ever since we were together. Maybe I woke up the beast in him. Update. Hi guys, I have gone through all of you guys' comments and I really appreciate it. I have also seen the hateful comments and truly, I deserve all of that. Let me get straight to the point. So guys, I ran out of the house in fear because I had never seen my husband that mad before. I went to my mom's house to explain what had happened. Honestly, she was really disappointed in me. I explained to her about how Fred and I weren't that couple we always portrayed whenever we were in the family gathering. At that point, she didn't stop reminding me of how she was irritated by my own foolish suggestion. The following day, I got a call from Gabrielle. At that point, I already knew that my husband had already told her about it. I couldn't pick the phone because I was very ashamed of myself. I got up that morning with swollen eyes. Apparently, I had cried all through the night after thinking about what I had suggested to my husband. I thought he also wanted to open it up since things were not like before. So I didn't pick the call and didn't return it back either. It had been 10 hours since I had left home, and my husband didn't call me. He switched his lines so I wouldn't be able to reach out to him. Just when I was about to leave the bed, I got a knock on my door. I didn't answer, and after a while, the person opened the door and came in. It was my mom. She sat down on the bed and told me Fred had sent something for me. I got up in the hope that maybe he wanted to see me. I got curious as to why he had to send me a package. I opened it and found out that it was divorce papers. I couldn't believe my eyes. My mom hugged me and patted me to stop crying. The divorce papers were already signed by Fred. I was left to sign it. My husband knew I would come see him after seeing the divorce papers, and so he traveled out of town that very day. He instructed our family lawyer to come back the next day to collect the papers after I had signed it. So, 2 days later after Fred left town, I signed the divorce papers and handed it over to the lawyer. It was a tough decision, but I had to make it because there was nothing I could do to change his mind. Update. Guys, it has already been months since my husband and I both went our separate ways. I moved out of my mom's house and managed to get a place to stay. I didn't want to go back and start staying with her. I wanted to be independent and have my own place. Fred moved on, and he never spoke to me since the last time I ran out of the house. I also have moved on with my life. I want to try and put my life together and also try out new things. Most times, I usually go to my store and get myself busy so as to make me forget all that has happened in the last few months. Gabrielle never called back ever since I ignored her call. I know I must have really hurt her, but I guess she wouldn't want to see my face again. So guys, this is my story. I hope you all have learned something from this. I hope none of you would make the same mistake I made. I should have never told my husband that. I guess this was a lesson well learnt.